Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales, a layman's history of war. I'm Scott, I'm a layman, and this is the first episode of my history of war. And since this is our first episode, I want to take a few seconds and talk about my title. It comes from an old soldier's joke. What's the difference between a war story and a fairy tale? One starts once upon a time. The other one starts no shit, there we were. So, no shit, here we are. Today, we're going to get into warfare, what warfare might have looked like in the days before we figured out how to record our history. Back when the closest thing we had to writing was pictures painstakingly drawn on the walls of caves. Back when the state-of-the-art of military technology was an atlatl, propelling a spear with a napped flint or obsidian head. When the best armor to be had might have been a shield made out of the skin of a bison or a buffalo, stretched over a frame of sticks. Back before we figured out how to work metal. Maybe even before we figured out how to make our own fire. That's right. Today we're going to start at the beginning. What do we know about war in the Stone Age? Of course, before we can even talk about that, we have to answer the question, what was the Stone Age and when was the Stone Age? If you're like most of us, if you think about the Stone Age at all, you don't think of anything more specific than way back when, a long-ass time ago. Maybe you think of a big hairy dude with a leopard skin draped over one shoulder, carrying a wooden club. If you're my age, maybe he's dragging a woman by the hair in his other hand. But how often do you stop to wonder just how accurate that picture is? Or how long ago we're really talking about? And if we're going to ask those questions in a show about war, it's fair to also ask what the hell the questions have to do with war at all. So the first thing we need to do is establish where we are in history, or prehistory in this case. And we have to do it without the benefit of written records, because as far as we can tell, nobody wrote down their history or much of anything else until the Sumerians started keeping records of commercial transactions about 10,000 years ago. And the periods we're talking about today go back a long time before that. And after we know where in the past we are, we'll need to talk about what we know about fighting in war way back then. And because we've already established that there aren't any written records going back that far, we're going to have to address the elephant in the room. How the hell can we know anything about this stuff so far in the past? Okay, so let's start with the first question. When was the Stone Age? This one's a little tricky to pin down because the earliest clues we have are so far back in the past. But it looks like stone tools have been around much longer than modern humans have. The earliest stone tools we've found are more than 3 million years old, while the oldest evidence we have for Homo sapiens, or people like us, comes from a little more than 300,000 years ago. So the Stone Age started a long time before humans came along. And the part we were involved in encompasses more than 99% of our history. We'll give that a minute to sink in. Think about the oldest human-made structure you can think of. Pyramids, Stonehenge, Jericho maybe. None of those is more than about 8,000 years old. And they are so old we know very little about them. Or maybe you're thinking about something older still, like maybe cave paintings. The oldest we know of those are from Indonesia, almost 44,000 years ago. There's an older one in Spain, but it seems like it was made by Neanderthals, not by modern humans. 44,000 years is so long ago that we know almost nothing about the people who painted those caves. And by the time we made those paintings, we had been around long enough to spread all over the world. On our feet, or in sailing vessels that Columbus and Zheng He, and maybe even Eric the Red would have been terrified to travel in. We're not sure how they did it, but they did. So let's just say the Stone Age started around the time we did, somewhere north of 300,000 years ago. How long did it last? Most archaeologists seem to think the Stone Age ended between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, when we figured out how to work softer metals like copper. 2,000 years is a pretty wide range, but when communication spreads at the speed a human can walk, it takes a while for new ideas to catch on. But stone gave way to copper, which pretty quickly gave way to bronze, then iron. And then somebody got the bright idea to start writing stuff down, and that was the end of the prehistoric period. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What else do we need to know about the Stone Age? Well, a couple of things. Number one, you'll often hear archaeologists and historians dividing the Stone Age up into three periods: the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic. That just means the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, and the New Stone Age. The Paleolithic is where most of our ideas of cavemen come from. Remember the guy we talked about a few minutes ago with the wooden club and the leopard skin and the woman by the hair? That's an idea from the Paleolithic, and probably not a very accurate one. The Mesolithic started about the end of the last ice age, 10 to 20,000 years ago, depending on where in the world we're talking about. In the Mesolithic, we started building permanent structures like gathering places, maybe sacred or ceremonial structures. We think we domesticated dogs sometime during this period. The Neolithic is the period when we started to settle down, grow crops, build cities. Most important to our purposes, most of the Stone Age battle sites we know about come from this period. And number two, and this is probably the most important thing to remember about the Stone Age, and the thing we're most likely to overlook, the people of the Stone Age were just like us. They didn't understand their world the way we do because they didn't have the benefit of 4,000 years of written history, or mathematics, or science, but their brains were just as complex as ours. Take a baby from the Paleolithic and raise her with modern schools and medical care and technology, and you'd never know she wasn't born in our time. The people of the Stone Age led harder lives than we do, and they didn't have a lot of the knowledge we do, but they loved their children, and they asked questions about their world, and they made art, and they made love, and tried to impress each other just like we do. And they fought just like we do. So that's the rough time period we're talking about. But how do we know anything about stuff that happened so long ago? Well, we ask a lot of questions, and people try to answer them, and some of the answers are close, and some might be right. And other people come along and use those answers to come up with new questions and hunt for new evidence. And every time we find something like a city or a house or an amulet or an arrowhead or a hand axe, it helps us understand a little better what life might have been like in the deep past. And when we find a bunch of similar somethings in one area and then another similar something a long way from that area, it gives us an idea of how people might have traveled and where they went. And when we find a bunch of dead bodies together, we can make a pretty safe guess that they died around the same time. And when many of those bodies have wounds consistent with the weapons we know people in that area had, wounds like broken bones, crushed skulls, arrowheads or spearheads embedded in bones or left in rib cages, well, we may have just found ourselves the site of a battle. And that's usually about all we can tell. Archaeologists have plenty of other tools and techniques they can use to learn more about the people involved and how long ago they lived, but I'll just be honest and I'll say I don't really understand how a lot of that works because I'm not an archaeologist. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but in this age when we get to just pick the truth we want to hear, I'm comfortable believing a trained scientist when he tells me how old something is or how the people in one area might have been related to the people in another area. So we can look at the evidence we have, like mass graves of people with wounds that look like war wounds, and we can conclude that battles happened even way back in the Stone Age. And the people who know this stuff can tell us about when it happened, but they can't tell us what the people in those mass graves called themselves, or why they were fighting, or whether their side won or lost the fight. So we won't really be able to evaluate these battles, although we will do a general analysis. But we can look at the evidence that's there and see what it can tell us. So what Stone Age battles do we know about, and where and when did they happen? By the way, I'll be adding a map to the channel, and I'll be marking the location of each battle we discuss as we go forward. Today's sites are all over the world, so a PDF isn't going to cut it. But I'm working on a solution, and I'll share it as soon as it's ready to go live. So, number one, the oldest of today's sites is called Jebel Sahaba, or Site 117, a burial site on the border of modern-day Egypt and Sudan. Here, 61 people of all ages, roughly 50-50 male and female, died around 13,500 years ago. Many of them had arrowheads embedded in their skeletons, or other wounds that seem to indicate that they died by violence. Now, this one may not actually be a battle, There's some more recent studies that seem to indicate that maybe these people all died of violence, but not all at the same time. So this one's maybe a little iffy. Number 2, at Naturuk in modern-day Kenya, 27 skeletons have been dated to about 10,000 years ago. Like Jebel Sahaba, many of these have wounds consistent with being shot with arrows, hit over the head, or stabbed with spears. It's a little bit amazing the kinds of things archaeologists can figure out from old bones. These two sites seem to be sites where groups of people were ambushed rather than killed in what we would today consider a stand-up fight. The arrows that brought them down apparently struck from behind and to the sides, indicating that they were shot from those directions. Picture a group of people walking along when suddenly archers start loosing arrows out of their hiding places along the path. It's not hard to imagine such an ambush, especially if you consider that they likely would have hunted animals in much the same way, hiding on a game trail and taking their shots as the herd passed by. Site 3. A lot of sites in this one, actually. There's a 10,000-year-old piece of rock art in Arnhem Land in Australia that appears to show violence between two tribes, and several from about the same age in Spain that show what looks like groups of archers fighting each other. I've used one of the pieces from Spain as the thumbnail for this video. Number 4. A little less than 10,000 years ago, the city of Jericho in what is now the West Bank already had a 12-foot stone wall overwatched by a 28-foot tower. The article I read suggested the wall may have been used for flood control and the tower for ceremonial purposes. But it seems to me that an earthen dike is usually better than a stone wall for flood control and easier to repair in the dry season when the waters recede. But the famous military historian John Keegan, in his book A History of Warfare, argues that the only thing you need a stone wall to keep out is other people, and I'm inclined to agree with him. Definitely evidence of conflict at Jericho. Number 5, and we have 3 related sites from about 7,000 years ago in Germany and Austria, with apologies in advance for my atrocious German pronunciation. A site from about 7,000 years ago called the Talheim Death Pit in Germany contains the remains of 34 people. Many of them have head wounds that look like they were inflicted with the Stone Age weapons or tools. This seems to be the earliest evidence of warfare in Europe. Next, there's a site near the village of Schletz, north of Vienna, from roughly the same time as Talheim. It contains the remains of 200 people, most killed by blows to the head. This site was surrounded by a double ditch about 300 meters in diameter, that's about 330 yards or so, that has been interpreted as a fortification. And a third site from the same period, this one at Kilienstadt, Germany, contains the remains of 26 individuals, all killed in similar ways and with similar weapons as the victims at Talheim and Schletz. Many of the bones at this site, particularly the bones of the victims' lower legs, seem to have been broken in a way that looks a lot like torture. So these 3 sites are all associated with a culture called the linear pottery culture, often abbreviated LBK for their German name, linear band ceramic. We call them that because just about the only thing we know about them is how they decorated the clay pots they made. But all 3 of these sites seem to have been communities of these LBK people, and it seems reasonable to conclude that they are the people in the mass graves, which means somebody was trying to wipe them out. Who and why, we will probably never know. But 3 related massacres associated with the same culture sure looks like a war, whatever else you might want to call it. Number 6. A site called Hamukar in northern Syria may be the oldest evidence we have of urban warfare. About 5,500 years ago, Hamukar was destroyed, apparently by a civilization we call the Uruk. Weapons caches found at the site contain slings and thousands of clay bullets. Now, the sling is about the simplest weapon you can imagine for throwing something. We'll talk about it in a few minutes, but for now, let's just say stockpiling this kind of weapon is pretty good evidence for a siege. Number 7. Also around 5,500 years ago, in Denmark and southern Norway, a culture called the pitted ware culture began replacing another called the funnel beaker culture. There we go, naming people after their pots again. Some funnel beaker settlements from the period seem to have been surrounded by wooden palisades, which we can interpret as evidence of conflict between these two groups. You don't need a wall, as we talked about before. You don't need a wall to protect yourself from animals, only from people. And number 8, since I'm sure you're wondering, it looks like Ötzi the Iceman, not his real name, probably died from the arrow that pierced his left shoulder about 5,200 years ago. But since we found no evidence of a battle around the area in the Alps where he was found, he's probably outside the scope of this show. Not to mention that he doesn't properly fit in the Stone Age at all, since he carried a copper-bladed axe. Just goes to show there are a lot of ways to die by violence that don't require being in a battle. Number 9. Of course, the Stone Age lasted a lot longer in some parts of the world than in others. The site of the Crow Creek Massacre in South Dakota contains the remains of at least 486 people who were killed, mutilated, and dumped in a mass grave sometime in the 14th century. That's the 14th century CE, when the people of Europe and China were just beginning to kill each other by the tens of thousands with a recent invention called gunpowder. And those are just the sites we know about. The ones where not only was the evidence preserved, but we managed to find it. You'll notice those sites are almost all clustered in Europe and West Asia and Africa. Does anybody really think these are the only places we fought? I don't. That's as good an opportunity as any to talk about the kinds of weapons Stone Age people used to kill each other. The most basic, of course, is the humble rock. A rounded stone that fits well in the hand can greatly enhance the amount of force a human arm can transfer to its target. When you figure out how to put an edge on it, it'll do even more damage. Now you have the earliest form of what archaeologists call a hand axe. If you could figure out how to put a point on it, you have a hybrid between a hand axe and a dagger. These are some of the earliest weapons we know of, and these are the kinds of tools we found from before Homo sapiens came along. And nature gives us lots of options other than rocks. Trees provide clubs and staves, both of which add leverage and hardness to a blow. Large animals provide long bones and jaw bones, both of which are heavier at the business end than at the handle. Very effective clubs, and you haven't even had to improve them yet. It's when you figure out how to do that things really start to get interesting. A sharpened staff can become a spear, which can penetrate even tough animal hides to pierce the organs beneath. Fire hardens wood, making clubs and spears more durable. And when you figure out how to make cords out of tough grasses or vines or animal hide or sinew, you can put stone and bone blades or points or strikers on wooden handles to make even more effective clubs, axes, and spears. And putting your rock on the end of a stick is not the only way to make it deadlier. A rabbit moves too fast to easily catch with your hands or skewer with a spear. You can stun or kill it by throwing a rock at it, but your arm has a limited range. You know where I'm going. We talked about slings a minute ago. You can throw a lot farther if you can figure out a way to make the rock go faster, and for that you need leverage. A leather strap with a pocket to hold the rock can accelerate it a lot faster than your hand, and if you can learn to release it at just the right time, you have just turned a humble rock into a formidable missile. Congratulations, you've just invented the sling. Lethal against small prey, crippling to deer, maybe even pigs, and annoying enough to convince a bull or a bear or a cat to give up their attack and go someplace else. Which brings us to other kinds of ranged weapons. Early hominids may not have had the right bone or muscle structure to throw their spears effectively, but we humans definitely do. A thrown spear or javelin gives a hunter a huge advantage over his prey. You can relieve a large animal of a lot of blood before it gets close to you, weakening or even killing it before it can do anything to stop you. But spears are heavy. Even a strong hunter-warrior can only carry a few. If you can figure out how to carry lots of them, you have an advantage. But the more you carry, the smaller they have to be, which means you have to figure out a way to propel them faster to do the same kind of damage. So you invent machines. First, an atlatl, a lever that allows you to throw your javelins farther and with greater force. Far enough maybe that you have to start putting feathers on them to make them fly straighter. Then you stretch a strong cord between two ends of a springy sapling and use that to send a tiny javelin faster and faster than just about anybody can throw it. Eventually, that tiny spear gets small enough that it can't be thrown effectively by hand or with an atlatl, and we give it a new name. We call it an arrow. And the cave paintings in Spain, as well as the points embedded in people's rib cages at Jebel Sahaba, tell us how effective it was against humans. We've talked about all these weapons in terms of how they help hunters take down their prey, but any weapon that works against a deer or a bovine will work just fine against a human. The weapons may not be specialized yet in the Paleolithic or the Mesolithic, but they're still plenty deadly. It's in the Neolithic that things get really interesting. That's when the technology of making blades takes a huge leap forward. See, for a long time, the state of the art in blade making was napping, or knocking a thin flake off a piece of stone and chipping off the edges until you have a sharp cutting edge. This requires a stone that fractures in predictable planes, like flint or obsidian, either of which gives you a blade that's very sharp but also very brittle. Good for knives and spears and arrows, but not great for axes or agricultural tools. Neolithic people solved that problem by learning how to grind and polish harder stone that didn't flake well. Neolithic tools had heads of granite or basalt or jade, polished to durable edges that could be used to cut down trees and break up firewood, as well as other uses. Many of the bodies at the LBK sites we talked about a little while ago had their heads broken open by a tool called a shoe-last celt, a polished stone blade lashed to the end of a wooden handle that would have been just as effective at splitting skulls as it was at splitting logs. These new methods of grinding and polishing stone also allowed clubs to evolve into hammers and maces, concentrating the weight of the club in a hard stone head that would have been even more effective and durable than a wooden or bone head. So you can pretty much shit can any ideas you have about noble Stone Age peoples living in harmony with their environment and with each other. I'm sure it happened in some parts of the world, but the problem with living in peace and harmony is that eventually somebody notices and decides they want what you have, and they're ready to take it away from you. And that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why, in an age when people were relatively scarce and it seems like there should have been plenty for everybody, would people fight each other? Seems to me there's probably three main reasons. Number one, you have something I want. Number two, revenge. And number three, my dick's bigger than yours. The first and probably the most common reason for fighting in the Stone Age, and frankly ever since then, is because you have something I want. The economists call it competition for scarce resources. Darwin called it survival of the fittest, even though he wasn't usually talking about people. Modern societies call it theft or maybe violation of somebody's human rights. The bottom line is this: if somebody or a group of somebodies has plenty of food or clean water or a great spot for shelter or plenty of women, and you don't have that for whatever reason, and they're not willing to share, you have two choices. You can go someplace else and look for your own stuff, or you can try and take theirs. Well, great. But why would somebody living in a wide open world decide to take somebody else's stuff instead of finding their own? Consider this. In a Stone Age world, want and need are pretty closely aligned. We're not talking about a situation where they have better tech and softer beds than we do. More like they have plenty of food and clean water and roofs over their heads, and our kids don't. Now, if you're a parent, try to imagine what kinds of things you wouldn't be willing to do if your kid were starving and somebody nearby had plenty and wouldn't share with you. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that list is pretty damn short. Because if your kid is starving and the distance you can travel in a day is limited to how far you can walk, and every step uses energy you can't replenish because you and your kid are starving, and you don't know how far you're going to have to go to find food, and they've got plenty right over there, well, things we would consider unthinkable start to sound reasonable real quick. So that explains why you might kill somebody over food and water, But there's evidence that some of the massacres we talked about might have been at least partly over access to women. And by access, I mean taking. At Talheim, for example, there are many fewer women among the dead than men, which might mean the attackers were looking to capture and carry off women instead of or in addition to other resources. In our relatively egalitarian age, it's a little hard to imagine killing a man or killing the men of a whole tribe would be an effective way to attract the women with them. But remember that very few cultures in human history have been as egalitarian as ours. And remember that the instinct to reproduce is powerful among young people even today. And intercourse without consent, rape, hasn't always been frowned upon as intensely as it is today. So, that covers the first reason for violence in the Stone Age. There's some overlap between it and the second one, revenge. After all, if your kid or your wife or your brother died because those people wouldn't share their resources and you managed to find enough that you didn't die, well, now you're healthy and pissed. Or maybe you're the ones who had plenty and they came and took what you had. Or you were young enough to run away and survive the raid, but they took your sister and you want payback and there's enough of you left to do some damage. And at some point, it really doesn't matter if they attacked you because you attacked them a couple of years ago. What matters is that you just can't let a raid go unpunished, because what if somebody else decides they can come take your shit and not have to worry about you fighting back? It's all very well to talk about ending the cycle of violence in our time of plenty, but when you're constantly one harvest or one herd or one drought away from starvation, there's a real practical question whether and how much raiding you can tolerate before you simply have to retaliate. Which brings us to the third reason to go to war. I call this one, my dick's bigger than yours. Vulgar, yes, but let me explain. This one probably grows out of one or both of the other two. Maybe your tribe was in dire straits a few years ago, and another tribe refused to help you. Or maybe they came and took your herd in a lean year, and lots of you died. Maybe you've grown strong since then, and you've already taken your revenge and punished them, and they're now a shadow of what they were when they took your stuff. You don't have to do anything to them now, except maybe make sure they don't ever grow strong enough to challenge you again. Or if you're particularly enlightened, you might make an ally or a client of what's left of them, so they don't need to challenge you again. Or you could pick option 3 and go back to finish the job. This is what I'm talking about. Wars of extermination or conquest might fall into this category, where you attack somebody just because they can't do anything about it. So that covers the what and the why. What about the how? What was Stone Age warfare like? That answer is probably different depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about. Remember that this part of our past covers almost our entire history. So to imagine war would be the same in the Neolithic as in the Paleolithic, if anything we would call war could even have happened in the Paleolithic, is a little like thinking war today would be the same as it was for the Romans, except the Neolithic is separated from the Paleolithic by about 100 times longer than we are from the Romans. But we can probably draw a few generalizations. For one thing, our modern armies of trained soldiers, our modern idea of armies of trained soldiers going toe-to-toe until one side breaks and runs away, probably doesn't apply until at least the Bronze Age, and not uniformly even then. Armies of trained soldiers really aren't even plausible until agriculture becomes a thing in the Neolithic. For the first time, growing our own food provided surplus calories, which allowed populations to grow bigger than ever before, which allowed for a meaningful division of labor, which allowed the ruling class to be separate from the laboring class, and also allowed a warrior class of people who didn't have to work in the fields every day to flourish. Before that, populations were small enough that every able-bodied man and woman would have been engaged in the day-to-day pursuit and preparation of food. If your population is small, maybe 100 or 200 people for a large tribe or as few as 20 for a small band, the loss of even a few able-bodied adults could be catastrophic. We're going to run some numbers here to demonstrate why. In most Stone Age cultures we know about, men and women probably hunted together, although it seems logical that women with children to provide for probably stayed back for the more dangerous parts of a hunt. But did the women go to war? That's harder to say. We know of enough matriarchal and matrilineal cultures that we might be able to do a whole episode sometime on how they approach war. It's certainly true that women have often gone to war in supporting roles, and women throughout history have taken up arms in defense of their homes. So for our example today, we're going to assume some of the tribe's childless women go along on our hypothetical war party. So if we take the large estimate and say we have 200 people in our tribe, let's say half are male and half female, just because that makes the numbers easier. Of those, maybe 20 are too old to hunt or fight, and maybe 40 are too young. 30 or 40 of the women are pregnant or have children to provide for. So you have 70 men and 30 or so women who can hunt for game to feed the entire tribe. If you take those 100 hunter warriors on a war party and 20 of them are killed, or worse, wounded badly enough that they still have to eat but can't hunt anymore, you've just significantly reduced your tribe's ability to gather enough calories to survive. Which brings up another likely feature of Stone Age warfare, one that's not evident from the examples above, but anthropologists have documented in the few modern-day tribes where warlike behavior has been observed. A sort of ritual warfare in which display and intimidation and maneuver are more important than killing. In ritual warfare, warbands will take the field against each other, maybe chasing each other around until both sides agree to stop and face each other. Then you have loose collections of men facing off over a stretch of ground, talking shit, looking tough until one side decides to give up and go home. Here you might have men chanting and dancing, stomping feet and clashing spears, or doing a group display like the Maori haka. Maybe they take turns and maybe they shout over each other. You may have a few spears or rocks thrown between the lines. You may have champions come forward into the space between the lines to challenge each other, which may result in contest of skill or single combat with clear rules. Maybe they fight to surrender, or maybe to knock down, or first blood, or rarely to the death. Ritual warfare might also take the form of semi-regular raids back and forth across territorial lines, with one party or the other raiding for cattle or plunder or women, in which pitched battles are rarely fought and people are rarely killed. This is the form tribal warfare took for thousands of years among the Celtic peoples of the British Isles, persisting in Scotland even into the Gunpowder Age. So let's look at it through the lens of the principles of war, a set of concepts we're going to be using to evaluate most of the battles we talk about here. The principles are important enough that we're going to give them their own episode later, but I wanted to start with some more interesting stuff first. We don't know enough about any of these battles to really evaluate them militarily, but we can use our framework to make some general observations. So the principles of war come to us from a military leader by the name of Karl von Clausewitz in the early 19th century. He came up with this list of principles, and we're going to list them for the first time here, and I'm going to explain them briefly, and then we'll talk about how each of these may have applied to Stone Age warfare. Okay, so the principles of war. There are 9 of them that come to us from Karl von Clausewitz, as I said. You can remember them, use a handy mnemonic to remember them. This is how I learned. The mnemonic is Moss Mouse. We're going to go through each one of them. So the first one is mass. Mass is your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. Mass is important because you want to bring overwhelming force against your enemy to minimize the risk to your own people. Second one is offensive. Offensive is the degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. Offensive is a key psychological advantage because the more you can make your enemy run away, the less energy he has to fight you and the less risk to your people. Next one, surprise. This is doing what your adversary doesn't expect. If your primary concern is bringing your own men home alive after you achieve your objective, surprise is going to be one of the most important tools in your pouch. Next one, security. Security is keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. If your goal is to surprise your enemy so you can kill as many of them as possible with as little risk to your own people as possible, you're going to want to prevent them doing the same to you. Maneuver. This is your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. You can get bonus points with your hunter warriors if you make the battle look like a hunt, since they're already familiar with that sort of maneuver. Next one is objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. It's important not to overreach when such a large part of the strength of your tribe is at stake. You need to remember your objective, to know when you've done what you wanted to do, so you can take what you came for and go home before your enemy can effectively respond. Next one stands for unity of command. And there we go off the edge. Unity of command. Every soldier on a battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. Unity of command comes pretty naturally to such a small group because everybody already knows everybody and has a pretty good idea of who they will follow if the leader goes down. The last S stands for simplicity. Simplicity, the less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. Simplicity is key when your troops don't spend all their time training for war. If you can stick to a few familiar formations and tactics, maybe making them look as close as possible to tactics you already use to hunt large, dangerous animals, you have an advantage. And finally, economy of force. Economy of force, your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. We can imagine that a Stone Age war party, especially one from a pre-agricultural society, is likely to prioritize economy of force over just about any other principle because of the small populations we discussed above. So, when we think about it, it seems pretty likely that the examples we talked about, the ones that left archaeological evidence, probably weren't normal for Stone Age battle. There were probably plenty of battles and wars that left no trace they ever happened, or at least none we can find after so many thousands of years. It's just that the massacre sites are unambiguous, where a single warrior killed in ritual combat, or even a handful of warriors, might be buried in much the same way as many others in the same site. It's hard to say whether he was killed in a battle or by some other form of homicide. But when a group of people have their heads bashed in and are dumped into a mass grave or a bog, it's pretty hard to imagine that's anything but a massacre. Whether it's a massacre that started as a battle or followed a battle, well, now we have to follow the clues we have and use some combination of logical reasoning and imagination to construct a likely story of what happened. It's the Stone Age. We're not likely ever to have the full picture of what happened, or how, or why. All we can do is look at the clues they left us and try to piece the picture together as best we can. And it's a good bet that violence and war was part of that picture. All right, I'd like to close with a little vignette from a lot later than the Stone Age. Before the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the Duke of Wellington's men asked him for some words of encouragement. The Duke, being a man of few words, gave them what might have been the shortest speech in military history. Piss when you can. I've found that to be good advice far beyond my time in the Army, so I like to pass it on as often as possible. So, thanks for watching. I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. See you next time.